Okay, now you should have your Cortex set up. You should have your servos and your flashlight plugged in. So our flashlight is going into port 5 and our servo is going into port 4. And then we have our motors. Again, if you're using a 3-wire motor, you're going to have them in motor ports 2 and 9. I'm using 2 wires, so I have them in ports 1 and 10. And now we're ready to update our Cortex by downloading the firmware to it, making sure that's up to date. So it's as easy as pushing this button on Robot C, this firmware download. This usually works, so we're going to start here. So we're going to just press that, and it says it downloads the Robot C firmware, and if we need to, we're going to have to manually do the master firmware update if we need to. So this should work, just the firmware for Robot C. So it's rewriting the firmware. This is basically the information that the Cortex needs in order to understand Robot C language when it compiles it. So it's an update for that. Every time you update Robot C, you have to update the firmware on the Cortex for it. Now we're going to go into some configuration things that need to happen. So when you first open a program, there's a few things that you need to do right off the bat. So the first thing is we need to change our communication mode. We're going to be using USB communication only. So what that means is that every time we want to talk to the Cortex, it's going to be through a USB connection. If you were using a VexNet connection, which is the wireless mode, you would use this competition, and I never use this first option. So it's either USB or VexNet. I really don't do both. If you pick the both, it'll search for the VexNet connection for 10 seconds, and then it'll switch over to USB. I would just stick in USB mode or the VexNet mode. Your compiler target is a physical robot. The platform type, we need to make sure that it's VEX 2.0 Cortex and natural language PLTW. Those we need to have checked. And if you do not see a natural language tab over here, you want to do a compile program, and it should pop up. There should be a natural language selection right under here. Once you have your firmware downloaded, we're going to see if we can download this code. This won't actually do anything because there's nothing in task main, but it compiled without error. So if you look, it said it compiled fine. If there are errors in your program, so I'm just going to take, let's say I mess this up and do this, and I hit compile. It's going to give me a bunch of errors while it compiled. So it tries to figure out what's wrong and tell you errors, but that's what's wrong. I didn't have that symbol in there. So we're going to go download to robot, and we should see that this goes and starts downloading. And it pulls open a program debug window. Now it's going to give you a couple things like the VEX Cortex main battery is not on, which it's currently not. If I look at my switch, it's currently off, and my light is red for robot. And if you notice, your VexNet light is green, and now your game light is green because it's going to be running it's running a program now. Go back here and just say, okay, it says it should be turned on now, so I'm going to turn that on and say okay. And right here in your debug window, if you have that part done, that's great. That's where you should be if it didn't work. So if that didn't download, we can close that out, and we're going to go back into Robot, download firmware, and we're going to manually update the firmware. We're going to manually update the CPU firmware, and then we're going to manually update the Robot C firmware. So we're going to do that manually. So if you're having issues, go to download firmware, manually update, master CPU, run it through that. And again, it should go through this. It gives you some messages saying that it's basically rebooting the thing. And it says, oh, it's disconnected. And it gives you this error. And it does this error. That's okay. Redo it. Just keep, oops, not that. Keep trying to manually do the CPU firmware, and eventually it'll go. And there it went. So now it's writing the firmware for it. So it might take you a couple times. Just be persistent. Eventually it should work. Sometimes you have to hold down the configure button on the front of the Cortex while you're turning it on. But again, we'll take care of that on Monday. If you're to the point where you're like, okay, I can't get this to work, we'll get it on Monday. So don't worry about it. Move on. You did your best. Write down what wasn't working and maybe some error messages that you were getting, so that way we can troubleshoot it when I get back. But again, it's going to take a minute to download the firmware. So we'll let this finish up. And then we're going to download the Robot C firmware again and manually update that. If you ever have a time where your program is not working, like you've got even just a basic program where you turned on a motor and it's not turning on and the power's on, the battery's connected, everything seems to be working, but it's not actually turning the motor on, do a redo of your firmware. Redo your master CPU firmware and then your Robot C firmware. So here we go. Master CPU firmware was downloaded successfully. Perfect. Now we're going to go in and we're going to manually do our Robot C firmware. So again, master CPU, standard file, Robot C firmware. Now we're going to click on standard file for it. And really, you should only have to do this one time for this entire semester. That's ideally. It might happen more than that, but it is what it is. And it says it was successful. That's great. Our Cortex should be ready to go. Whatever we put in here now, we should be able to download. So I'm going to make a simple program. I'm going to go into natural language under movement. And this is where I'm going to find my start motor. I'm clicking and dragging. I'm going to go under wait. And then I'm going to click on my stop motor. Click and drag. And now I can put in the motor port. And I want to do the left motor. Remember, that's now a variable. So I'm going to hit the tab button and it's going to automatically finish that off. I'm going to just do a speed of 50 for right now. Remember, it can go from negative 127 to positive 127. I'm going to wait for 2 seconds. You don't have to put a unit on this. It defaults to seconds. And then we're going to stop the left motor. And again, I typed in left M and hit tab and it finished my motor for me. This magic wand is fantastic. Hit that, it will auto indent and tabify all of your stuff. I'm going to remove some white space. This white space is good. I'm going to add some comments. Starts the left motor. Tabbing. Waits for 2 seconds. Now, do you have to do this when you get better? No. But I want you to get in the habit of commenting your stuff. And that should kind of match your pseudocode. And there it is. So, let's compile. It compiled great. It didn't give me any errors. Again, if I leave off a semicolon and I compile, it gives me a warning. It says you have a missing semicolon. It's automatically been inserted by the compiler, so it's smarter than you. No. It does make fixes to some of your code if they're little small things. But you want to get rid of warnings and errors. You're going to download it. So it downloaded, and now we can actually look and see what's going to happen. So let's take a look. I'm going to move this off to the side. Here's my program debug window. And we're going to look at this left motor, which is plugged in right here. And we're going to take a look. When I hit this start button, so on this program debug window, I'm going to hit start. And let's look at what happens. Nothing's running. Interesting. But see, it runs through the program. Look what happens. It goes start, it's in the wait, this is the next line of code, and it stops my program. See that? Start, 1, 2, now it's back to the start. So you can manually stop it any time during the thing, but it'll stop on its own. So why is it not running? Well, now we have to troubleshoot to figure out what's going on. First thing I'm going to do is look and make sure I have power. Okay? and my robot light is not green. Okay, it wasn't green, it was turned off. So I'm first checking that to make sure that's good. It's still not working. So I'm going to look at my code and make sure that my codes are right. Well, let's look right here in my motor and sensor setup. Oh, I changed this and it's not correct anymore. If I look at my motor and sensor, I have my right and left motor in ports 1 and 10, and on here I have them in ports 2 and 9. So this is not correct. So I'm going to cut and paste, and this is a 393. There's nothing here, and this is a 269. So I had something wrong in my code. So when it was saying left motor, it was turning on the wrong port. So it wasn't powering my motor. So this is how troubleshooting works. You just kind of look at what you have and you go through it. Now we're going to recompile. It compiled without error. And we're going to re-download. And now we're going to hit the start button. Again, I'll pull this up here so you can see both. So I'll move this out of the way. And now watch what happens. And now it starts moving. And it went for 2 seconds. You can kind of hear it. And then it stops. So that's what you want to be able to do by the end of the period today, is to try to get your left motor to turn on for 2 seconds and then stop. Sometimes you might see a warning that says power cycle. Okay, so if you see the word power cycle after you download, it'll say you need a power cycle. I'm going to pull that up by doing something here. I'm going to change my communication mode, and I'm going to download to the robot so you get that error message, because I want you to see what it looks like. See this right here? VEX Cortex power cycling is required. Power cycling is this. You turn off the battery, you unplug the USB port, you plug it back in, and then turn it back on. So again, I'm going to go through those 4 steps again. You turn off your Cortex, you turn the battery, or you unplug the USB cable, you plug the USB cable back in, and you turn it back on. So that's what it's basically saying, is you need to power cycle in order for this to work. So basically reboots your system, because we're changing a major setting in that. So I'm going to go back to USB communication, and I'm going to re-download, and it's going to say you're going to need to power cycle. So I'm going to go through that on camera. So again, here's what a power cycle would look like. So I'm going to turn off the Cortex. So again, if you look at the lights, you currently have a red robot light. It should go, or green, it should go red when you turn off the power. Unplug the USB. I'm going to plug the USB back in. And I'm going to turn the power back on. And that is a power cycle. And now I can re-download. If it says failure reading rig status, re-download. Close this out. Re-download to your robot. Sometimes they'll say no communication. So unplug your USB cable and replug it back in. And wait like 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3. Now hit download to robot. And now it's making connection. I'll say I need to turn my main battery power on. So I'll turn my main battery on. I'll hit start, and there it goes again. So we can see it. I'll show it running here just so you can confirm. You can see that moving. That's what we want to be able to do. On Monday, we're going to start looking at sensor values. So if you look at, there's some windows down here that we can open up. If we go into debugger windows, you can actually click on motors, and now you can see your motors and sensors. And when I hit start, you'll notice that my motor speed goes to 50. And if I go to sensors, I can like push some of my buttons, and you can see their values changing, which is kind of neat. So that's what we're going to do on Monday. So hopefully you get that done. When you're done with this, you can start watching the videos that you need to have done by Monday. Thanks.